remembrance of the difficult seasons, of our darkest hours. To remember is to honor. To honor is to value. What we value shapes who we become. Throughout Scripture, God urges us to remember the sacrifices made, the freedom gained, the promises kept, the faithfulness of God. Through symbols and sacraments and holy disciplines, God has continued to urge us to always remember, because He knows what remembering does inside of us. Remembering gives purpose to our past by drawing wisdom, strength, and resolve from our pain and loss. Remembrance brings gratitude for those ordinary people who became extraordinary heroes. Remembrance strengthens community as we discover what God does through us when we are unified. Remembrance provides perspective of what God has done on our behalf in spite of our fears and worry. Remembrance reignites hope in what God will bring us through today and forever. Because God is faithful, even in our darkest hours. God is always there. Whatever we face today, whatever trial it seems we cannot endure, remember, God has always brought us through, and He always will. This is why we remember.
Remembering 9/11. The video says that it gives us purpose to our past, it gives us gratitude, certainly to those first responders and those heroes, and all of the servicemen that responded since then and continue to serve folks in places like Afghanistan. It gives our faith certain perspective, and it also renews our faith and gives us hope. 10 years ago, it's obvious that it was a very different time. Our economy was very different at the time. It's fair to say that our 401ks were on solid ground. But it's also fair to say that 8 out of 10 Americans probably never heard of jihad or bin Laden or Al-Qaeda. The Brentwood housing market was booming. And in 2001, in May of 2001, Marcy and I decided to move to Antioch, California from San Francisco. We had 0 kids, 2 jobs. Life was good, right? And we were anticipating the arrival of our firstborn, Samuel, that was going to come later in 2002. All accounts, it was a pretty regular Tuesday morning, with one exception that 4 planes left 3 airports within 12 minutes of each other, which wasn't particularly unusual. But as we know now, that American Flight 11 from Boston to LA, United Flight 175 Boston to Los Angeles, American Flight 77 from Washington Dulles to Los Angeles, and United Flight 93 from Newark, New Jersey to San Francisco had a very different plan that day. At that time of my life, I was doing a lot of business traveling, so I was very familiar with these particular flights and had colleagues on one of those flights. I remember one colleague, particularly Phil, who was an engineering director at our company that I used to work with. I ran the cartridge business at the time, so I worked quite closely with Phil. Well, his life changed obviously that day, and so did his family. He was on flight American 11 and crashed into the North Tower. I commuted every day, so it wasn't unusual for me to wake up in Antioch, California at 5:30 in the morning. That would be 8:30 New York time. But what was particularly unusual that night before was that I had set the alarm clock from the normal buzz, annoying buzz sound you would set it to music, because I kind of got tired of the buzz sound. And I set it for 5:30. 5:30 came along, I hit the snooze button, and the music came on, I hit the snooze button. And the snooze was for 10 minutes. 5:40 ran around, and the music came back on, I hit the snooze button one more time to get 10 more minutes of sleep. At 5:50, which was 8:50 New York time, there was a very different sound on the radio. It wasn't music. It was a news broadcast, and I thought that's particularly odd. Why would a news broadcast be on this particular radio station? I'm laying in bed and I realized that the news broadcast had some very specific things that they wanted to get across. At that time, American Flight 11 had crashed into the North Tower at 8:48 a.m., which is 5:48 Brentwood time. So I ran downstairs and turned on the news, and that's when I witnessed at 9:03 a.m. the next flight went into the South Tower. Well, it's clear that by the collapse of the buildings at 10:25 and 9:59 a.m., which is still well early in the morning Brentwood time, that something horribly had gone wrong. And then I started to think. Well, I was fearful. One, because I realized that I had taken, certainly on a number of occasions, the flight between San Francisco and Newark and Washington, Dulles, and LA. And I just didn't happen to be on one of those flights at that time, and certainly had colleagues. So I was fearful for the folks I had worked with. I was also very angry. I had not gotten to my faith part, and I was stuck in the anger part for a while, and I was really upset that this was happening. It was clear it was a calculated attack after the third and fourth planes had crashed. I was going to be a father-to-be, and I was going to have to explain this to my firstborn Sam in a few months. And I certainly was in no mood to forgive. That was the farthest thing from my mind. But I would say mostly I was weary. How can God let something like this happen? If we all believe as Christians that God has control over everything, has dominion over everything, how can God let something like this tragically happen? So I was weary about my faith. Today's gospel reading is the parable of the unforgiving servant, Matthew 18:21-35. We're not going to stand for this because I just want to kind of highlight a few things. If you listen or read this parable in Matthew 18:21-35, you start to realize that there's a very specific message that relates to the events of 9/11. To set this up, Peter is basically going to Jesus and asking Jesus, look, if people come to my church and they sin against me, how many times do I forgive them? Do I forgive them 7 times, 6 times, 5 times? And Jesus said, no, not 7 times. Forgive them 77 times, which is essentially forgiving them forever. And then he tells the parable of the unforgiving servant, where a king who wished to settle his debts with his servants calls upon one particular servant that owed him much money at the time, many, many talents. Talents were about $10,000 or so equivalent. And the servant realizes that the king knows that he owes him this money, realizes he can't pay for the debt, so he goes to the king to ask for forgiveness. He says, have patience with me. I will pay you someday. And out of pity of him, the king forgave the slave and the servant and released him. Now, what's particularly interesting about that is then the servant goes out to his fellow servants, where obviously Those folks had owed debt to him. And he comes up to another servant and he said, hey, you owe me money too. Now he's putting into the position of being the king. And that particular servant says to the servant that owed the king the money, he said, forgive me like your king has forgiven you. And he decides not to forgive him. He decides to throw that particular servant in jail. Well, all the other servants are particularly annoyed by that and concerned by that. And so they go back to the king and they say, hey, you forgave this particular servant, but this particular servant did not forgive his brother. And so that king brought the servant back to him and asked him, why didn't you forgive your brother? I forgave you. Well, the moral of the story is that you must forgive the sinner, and not the sin. The parable outlines the detailed relationships between a community of people. Jesus is basically telling us that it's important to forgive the sinner, but remember the sin. Yes, I forgive you, but not the debt. For the relationship between the king and the servant to continue, the debt, the sin, must continue to stop. But the relationship continue as long as the king forgives the sinner. On 9/11, my heart was not in a particular state of forgiveness. It's very hard. I was angry, resentment, and weary, and particularly questioning my faith at the time. It's hard to imagine most people today that could forgive the events of 9/11. The parable of the unforgiving servant teaches us that you must forgive the sinners and remember the sin. If you look at the Lord's Prayer, a core to the Lord's Prayer, forgiveness is both giving and receiving. It's reciprocal. For I forgive others who trespass against me. For my heavenly Father will forgive me when I do that. On September 11th, my particular faith was awakened. I was a bit weary, certainly. It was really the first time that I had to really rely on my faith to understand how to forgive. It's interesting, in June 14, 1954, the Congress officially changed the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America to include two simple words, and that was, under God. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Certainly the intentions of the events of 9/11 were that to divide the United States of America. But our response to that was unity. The intense and unforgiving acts of 9/11 was to intend to confuse us, but we responded with a certain amount of clarity. Our intent to fall apart as a nation. As Americans, we banded together for the years to come. Certainly was the intent to create hate. We responded with love and care for our fellow citizens. It was our intentions to be weary of our faith. We responded by relying on our faith. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Because unity, clarity, banding together, responding with love, and relying on our faith is what one nation under God does. God is always there to shape our values. Forgiveness is a virtue to the Christian faith. Our values define who we are. I'm going to play a short video now. Just remember that particular day. And I want you to think about how you felt that particular day and how you have grown in the 10 years since that day.
We just had a plane crash into Alpha 4 of the World Trade Center, transmit a second alarm, and start relocating companies into the area. The World Trade Center, tower number 1, is on fire. The whole outside of the building, there was just a huge explosion. We have a number of floors on fire. It looked like the plane was aiming towards the building. World Trade Center, send every available ambulance, everything you got to the World Trade Center now. George, have them mobilize the Army. We need the Army in Manhattan.
And we heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere.
Marine 6 to Manhattan, urgent.
Hazmat 1, stand by. Marine 6, go.
You have a second plane into the other tower of the Trade Center, major fire. Marine 3 to Manhattan, urgent. One of the buildings is partially collapsed. Marine 3, a major collapse in one of the towers. The South Tower, major collapse. Anybody hear me? I'm a civilian. I'm trapped. The other tower just collapsed. Major collapse. Major collapse. The World Trade Center's collapsed. Building 2 has collapsed. Okay. Right now we're all alone. The second building came down. I can't see. So we have no contact with anybody at this time, okay?